the staff now at the authority are really making wonderful progress. So I'm just excited. I really look forward to seeing what the future will bring. As I look back on my career, thinking about the question you asked, do I see myself as a trailblazer? I would say now I do. I was fortunate to have had opportunities to achieve and lead. I think that set the stage for other women, both inside the authority and in industry constituencies and organizations. I certainly didn't set out as a conscious goal to be a trailblazer. Rather, I saw myself as needing to work hard, to learn as much as possible, to contribute value, in particular to overcome my shyness and to continually challenge myself to be able to meet whatever opportunities there were that presented themselves, so that I could be successful. So yes, as a trailblazer when I look back, but no, that was never my intent. And certainly it was an unexpected result of my career.
You had 2 stints at the Port Authority, correct? You were there for a period of time, you left, and then you came back, correct?
I did, that's correct.
So when you came to the Port Authority for the first time, it's 1970, correct?
Correct.
What did you know about the agency?
Well, I'm going to answer that two ways, Alfred. First, I joined the authority in August of 1970 in the Rail Transportation Department as a junior administrative assistant. And my role there was, my title was Coordinator of Federal Aid Programs. And that meant I would be responsible for coordinating the applications and managing the grants that the Port Authority at that time was able to take advantage of. And they were grants for the construction, the planning and design of the General Square Transportation Center and for past station improvements. I had wanted to work at either the Port Authority or the MTA, first because I knew that both agencies had great reputations, and secondly, because I was hooked on transportation in that the prior 3 years of my career life had been spent in Washington in the transportation arena. The next reason I wanted to join either agency was because I knew that both Dr. Borrone, who was the chairman of the MTA, and Lou Gambaccini, who was director at the Port Authority and the Rail Department, had sterling reputations and were seen as leaders that young people could learn a lot from if they were associated. The New York Port Authority, as it was then known, was well respected nationally. The leadership of the authority had a focus on regional needs. It was seen as having integrity, hiring and keeping and rewarding good performers, promoting regional and national policies, and demonstrating how a semi-autonomous agency could achieve significant projects with efficiency and effectiveness. So those were all very attractive elements to me. But I think the thing that was most interesting to me was that when I interviewed at the authority, the HR person with whom I spoke, and I'll never forget him, said, there are many businesses here and you'd have the opportunity to move among them if you were interested and had a good reputation. So I thought, wow, this is a place that would be quite attractive and an interesting place to work. I also knew from the folks in Washington with whom I worked at USDOT that there were difficulties that the Port Authority was experiencing because its leadership and the leadership of the two states were not in agreement about how the Port Authority might be able to meet the state's desire for funding to provide commuter rail services. So while I knew that there was this terrific sterling reputation, I also knew that there were some issues, but I didn't necessarily think that they would affect somebody at my lower level in the agency at the time.
Well, now you came to the agency at an interesting moment because Austin Tobin, who had been a very significant force at the agency for decades, that era is ending. The 70s were a financially challenging time in the region.
They were.
as they move, and many people forget that, what they were like. But also you mentioned PAF. PAF was a reasonably new acquisition for the Port Authority in 1970. What was that like coming, PAF, Journal Square, exciting?
It was exciting. And first of all, we had a mandate from the board and the executive director to make improvements on the railroad. And that was something that Lou and the staff were very specifically focused on. But we also wanted to try to do as many improvements as possible in terms of how we promoted our service and what we offered, so that the commuter who was using the system would become more loyal, and also would be maybe a little bit forgiving, as sometimes we suffered disruptions because of system breakdowns, or because of investments that we were making, and the need for stand downs periodically. I also think what was interesting was that we were a small cadre of staff, and we relied on a lot of resources throughout the agency, and we had a pretty effective team. What I found interesting, and what I learned a great deal from, was that many of the railroaders, the people who came with PATH from the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad, were really wonderful people who wanted to make this a gym. And in my job, as I was just mentioning, as federal aid coordinator, I learned a lot. I spent hundreds of hours with they were all gentlemen, with the gentleman who ran the signal systems and the other aspects of the operations. I had to understand what they did and why they did it in order for me to be successful in explaining what the needs were in these grant applications. So it was an interesting time, and we were trying to really put in place new services and new approaches to the operation on a relatively scaled down financial budget.
Well, you mentioned when you joined, and it's a key thing that people talk about even now, that one of the beauties of the Port Authority is you could start out, say, in rail and find yourself then move to port, or move to aviation, or perhaps in a staff department where you're now dealing with not a line department. That's very true of your career. I may have some of these things off, so correct me, but I mean, you were a special assistant to the director of terminals at one point, assistant director of aviation, first director of management and budget,
Right.
direct reports, and before, when you were in your trailblazing glory, you were the assistant executive director. So can you describe some of the transitions about how you sort of embrace and learn? You can go from aviation to ports, from PAF.
I, I want to say two things, if I may. One, I'd like to step back in time to the 70s that you were talking about a few minutes ago, and talk about when I joined the agency. What did I see? I didn't see very many women, but fortunately there were women in senior positions in communications and HR, human resources. I don't think we called it that then. It was called personnel, if I remember correctly. The law department, and the secretary's office. So we had some role models. What I think was important to me was that the leadership of the authority stressed that they really expected every employee to be the best they could be at their jobs. And in rail, that was clearly the case. The expectation was you were the best. And if you were, your manager appreciated you, and he was valued, or she was valued, and you both were rewarded in some fashion. The PA was generous with tuition refund, and also with internal training. And I think those two things were very important foundations for me in my career, because yes, I could see some role models up there, but to get there, I needed to be able to understand the Port Authority way, and I needed to be able to demonstrate that I was serious about my job. So I took as many internal courses as I could, and I also used tuition refund, and I went to school at night, and got my master's from Manhattan College in civil engineering. And I was the only woman in the class at that time. We also were encouraged to contribute our talent internally and externally. And that's another important foundational piece in terms of my career, because well, I had come from Washington and I knew, not having been born or raised there, but I had gone to school there and I had my early work experiences there. I knew a bit about the transportation structures, but it was important to learn about the Port Authority in a very different way. And that was by contributing. So I got appointed to the Internal Port Authority Advisory Group, which was sort of a mirror to your board. So we were the internal staff who are the board, and ideas were brought to us, and we were asked for our views and opinions. I was asked to sit on the Tri-State Regional Planning Commission studies for various transit issues. I participated externally at the Transportation Research Board. In fact, later in my career in 1995 was the first female to chair the TRB, and I'm very proud of that. There were many others, but they were all designed, I think, to gain skill, to gain connections, to be able to represent the Port Authority in bringing information, ideas, policy thoughts, technical suggestions, even influence regulation and law, and also to bring back ideas that the Port Authority could capitalize on. So that sort of all set a foundation in terms of skill and focus and approach that led me to opportunities. And you asked about how did I make transitions? Well, the rail to terminals transition occurred because I, having worked with all of the staff on PATH, focusing on technical issues, realized that if I wanted to advance in the organization, especially because I wanted to be, my goal was to be a line department director one day, I really needed to have operational experience. And while the director of rail, Lou Gambaccini, and his deputy were very supportive of me, they didn't ever expect that I would want to go into operations. When Jack Rosen, who was the terminals department director, had this special assistant position open up, I applied for it and I interviewed and I succeeded in getting it, with the understanding that the special assistant's position would be used as a rotational opportunity, and 3 facility manager roles would be operational rotations as well. And all of us who are rotating would have the opportunity to go into every position. So I wound up, after spending my first 6 months as special assistant, becoming the first woman to manage a facility by managing the truck terminals in New York and New Jersey.
If your first experience running in operations is trucks.
Truck terminals, right?
It's not even what you think of as the, it's like the sleek sexiness of being in aviation. It's trucks. How were you received? What was that like?
I was frightened. First of all, others with whom you've spoken who were longtime PAers would recall some of the individuals who managed various facilities, including our general manager of operations then, who was a retired merchant marine fellow, and he had a vocabulary that was, full of swear words as much as it was general English. So first of all, I had to be able to demonstrate that it wasn't going to faze me to listen to a string of blue words, which it didn't. And then secondly, I had to really try to understand what was going on at the facilities, I should say, and what needed to happen. The businesses weren't too difficult to understand once you learn the language and once you developed relationships with the staff there and understood what was expected. So I was able to succeed in managing those 2 facilities, and that was a good thing because it gave me the opportunity to move into the other operating facilities. And it also gave our director the opportunity to point out the fact that if I could do it, meaning me, Lillian, then other women were likely to be able to do it as well. And so in the second rotational group there was Alice Herman, one of the women who succeeded me, who was able to move on in her career as well into operations.
Let's sort of fast forward a bit.
I left the organization. I said to you a few minutes ago that I worked with Joe Vanacore on the merger of tunnels and bridges and terminals, and then I left. What happened was a couple of things. Peter Goldmark joined the organization as executive director in '77, I think. And he was reinvigorating the authority, building relationships with the board and with the governors. He was developing the Committee on the Future and thinking about what the region could become with our help. In 1978, Lou Gambaccini was offered the position of Commissioner of Transportation in New Jersey, and he asked me to come with him. But at the same time, President Carter was staffing the USDOT teams, and I was invited to return to USDOT as a political appointee, as Associate Administrator of what's now known as the Federal Transit Administration for Policy and Budget. And it was attractive, and transit was my interest, and so I took that job. And I left, and I had a fantastic time as a federal political appointee. Running a federal agency. And I sincerely mean that, because even though I was associate administrator when Mr. Carter had that Saturday night massacre and fired a lot of people, I became acting deputy administrator, and then I became acting administrator for a while. And so I really, at 32, was running a federal agency, and that was kind of heady stuff. I stayed until the administration changed, and then I became a lobbyist. And I represented the MTA and the American Bus Association and a number of private companies, and I really enjoyed it. But after a couple of approaches from the Port Authority to come back, I kept turning them down. The third one was the charm. The aviation director, who was a longtime friend of mine because we worked in Washington together, invited me to return as Assistant Director of Aviation. And what he was offering was the opportunity to be Assistant Director for Business and Economic Development. And what he really wanted was to have me work with him and his staff on planning for the redevelopment of the 3 airports, because I had training in strategic planning while I was in Washington. I had some of the background from Washington. I had the training that he needed. And so staff and I worked together in really different team aspects, and we developed and began to implement a modernization program for the airports.
Newark had a lot of, in that period of time, Newark had a lot of expansion, particularly, correct?
Yes, and that's what I was just about to mention, that we initiated the Newark, the Best Kept Secret campaign. We designed and implemented the taxi programs at the airports. We planned the implementation of the monorail at Newark, which of course had been conceived of, but had not been implemented. And then we negotiated new services that were launched, like the People Express service, which was an exciting opportunity for the region and particularly for Newark Airport. But we also did a lot of focused work at Kennedy. The problems were significant because of hours and hours of delays at Kennedy because of traffic volume. So we were spending a lot of time thinking about, new runways, new taxiways, how to reconfigure terminals for services. Very exciting things. And at the same time, this was all happening, we were also realizing that we weren't delivering very well, even though the board was approving capital authorizations for us. We weren't really delivering those programs very well in the field.
Peter Goldmark it's spoken that one of the things he's actually most proud of now was the development also of the industrial park system. The emphasis of the Port Authority was beginning to shift also in that you could also be the leverage for economic vitality and regional growth.
I've just mentioned a few minutes ago that one of the things we realized is that we weren't doing very well in delivering on the capital program because we just didn't seem to be able to put in place all the contracts that we needed to in order to achieve the timeframes we had hoped for. Peter looked at the financial situation and he looked at our capital planning situation and realized that some changes needed to be made. And so he organized a restructuring of the agency financially and operationally. And what he did was he created the chief financial officer structure. He created the controller and treasurer under the CFO. And then he created a management and budget department. And later he created a chief of capital programs. It was when this structure was put in place and Peter asked me to become director of management and budget. And I was in complete shock. I really loved aviation. I thought there was an opportunity eventually to succeed the director there. And that's where I wanted to be. But I also realized that if I said no, it was unlikely I was going to get asked another time to become a department director. And this was an opportunity for a woman to be a department director. And so why not? So I said yes. What we focused on was how to build a new structure that took us from the strategy to the capital planning, the financial planning, and then the engineering and staff implementation. And that structure is one of the things I'm most proud of because the work we did, Giovanna Cora, Bob Bennett, and I, with our staffs, really helped us to be able to demonstrate to the board that we deserved the resource they were appropriating to the line departments because the line departments in engineering were now capable of actually putting these facility improvements in place in a timely fashion. Okay, so Peter agreed. He had the concepts that the Committee on the Future had come up with. We began the development of the industrial parks, and particularly in Elizabeth, negotiated with the community, and that was not an easy negotiation. I'm sure he probably talked a little bit about that, and put the opportunity for them to develop those facilities, and for us, the Port Authority, to develop those facilities to meet regional economic needs. As management and budget director, though, I'm listening to the director of the airport aviation, and at that time, and I'm also listening to the port director, and both of them are saying to me, how can you not fight the commitment of that property to an industrial park when we know we need that property for expansion purposes for the airport and the port? So you can imagine that we had quite a series of arguments back and forth, but Peter was right. It was appropriate, and politically it was the correct thing to do then, and certainly it's proven to be the correct thing now for those investments to have been made.
You think back, what was actually more fun, working in a line department or working in the front office? Because there's two different kinds of achievements that you have at the end of your day.
Okay, I have to be honest. Working in the line department was for me, because it turns out I'm the kind of person who sees the bigger picture and who is entrepreneurial. I didn't realize it when I first took a line functional role, but I liked it. I like being competitive. I like seeing what the opportunities are and going after them. I like having staff, really rally around and go achieve.
You were there during 1993.
I was. Yeah.
And as we're taping this, this is really just like a week and a half from the anniversary of the bombing of the Trade Center. Um, Beyond the moment that you're experiencing getting out of the building, you've spoken, I've heard you speak in the past about the bond that formed among the people who experienced that. And there's a lot of academic conversation about the resilience and the sort of go-to-itiveness of the people of the Port Authority. But there are moments when that actually was put to the test.
That's right.
And can you maybe now, because you have decades to look back on, talk about just that, how you saw the character of people, not the day, but the character of people from that moment and going forward about the agency?
We are a family. I need a minute.
Okay.
That was a very difficult time, but with the recognition that we needed to find each other and to get to work, all of us took whatever steps we could that day and the next to put in place the capabilities to keep operations moving forward. And I think part of what we saw was that we were linked. We were linked by our common love for the agency, our common support and love for each other, and our willingness to do what it would take to revive and repair that facility, the building, so that we could get back there. We wanted to be back in our home. It was tough for some of us to return there. People were afraid. There were some members of my staff at the time I know that never were able to come back. They were placed in other facilities or in other positions around the region, and some actually just never got back. But for the rest of us, it was a way of trying to cope. But I think many of us did not cope very well. We I guess didn't think at the time that we had been affected as deeply as it turned out we were. To have recurring dreams, or to have physical ailments, or to years later realize that some things that were bothering us were the result of that.
What would you say to people of the agency now?
First, if I can, to speak to the young professional staff or people who might be looking to a career. I know that in today's world, many people say, oh, you should never spend your entire career in one place. But I think it's possible and still valuable, and particularly in an agency like the Port Authority, because it has so many different business opportunities. You can really spend your career and not do the same thing. And really gain and contribute importantly. If I were starting out today, I would certainly look at the Port Authority as a career opportunity. And I think it's important because there's an honor in public service. And the PA is an agency, an organization where you have the opportunity to learn a lot, to achieve significant things, to work at iconic facilities, and to have the pleasure of knowing that you made a difference. It's been a proud 100 years. I think it's achieved a tremendous amount for the region and for the nation. And I can't wait to see what else you do. We do.